America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation.
And I'm Jordan Bruno, vice president at Job Creators Network.
Please subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcast from. Today, we are joined again by John Carney. John's part of Breitbart News, where he leads finance and economics sections. John rejoins us to talk about Bidenomics and the danger of a potential Harris-Walz presidency. John, we're so excited to have you back.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. There's plenty to talk about.
Oh, I was going to say, it's been so boring lately in the news. No, seriously, though. I mean, so much, it's been like a complete sea change. I mean, almost whiplash. And, you know, I was reading Maureen Dowd in the New York Times, who basically said it's a coup, but Democrats are happy about it. And I guess I can see why, because of how things were going for Biden. I mean, I understand that. But just from a democratic viewpoint, I mean, is it really okay that 14 million votes were just set aside constitutionally? I mean, it may not be unconstitutional, but is it really okay?
It seems extraordinary that Democrats went from being, really enthusiastic about, or claiming to be enthusiastic about Joe Biden to just tossing him overboard altogether and saying, yeah, hooray. And if you look at the numbers, they really are very excited about this coup. They love the fact that they were able to get rid of their losing candidate. I mean, I sort of get it, right? Like if you're on a baseball team and your pitcher is just not getting the job done, you want them to bring in the sub, right? And this is what they've done. They brought in somebody who might be able to, get the ball over the plate a little more. So of course they're more excited about this. Although I do think it does make a lot of their arguments about, this election is about democracy. Democracy is on the ballot a lot less plausible since they've just decided that their entire primary system didn't matter, that they didn't need to run a primary to sub in Kamala Harris. They could just more or less anoint her, and the Democrats went along with it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the what is it? The ends justifies the means, and in the end, they believe that the only goal is to beat Donald Trump at all costs.
Right. Everything else is can be subverted to the goal of beating bad orange man. But I do think that they've hurt their arguments, and I actually think that they might find out that Kamala is less prepared than she would have been had they actually, run even an abbreviated primary contest. One of the nice things about a primary contest is that, and we had this on the Republican side, is that you hone your arguments. You actually get better at being a candidate because you have to come up against people saying, no, pick me instead. Mm-hmm. And Kamala hasn't had that. She was literally anointed. She hasn't been confronted at all about her ideas. And she certainly hasn't had to prove them in a debate with somebody else who, thinks they'd be a better president than her.
John, Kamala's hidden from the media, hidden from press conferences. For weeks, it was just vague cliches about abortion was her entire platform, it seemed like. And then finally last week, she dropped some economic policies. Is Kamala essentially a third term of Biden, or does she offer any new ideas?
She seems to be mostly a third term of Biden, except worse. No wonder why they were keeping her in hiding, because when she did come out with plans, they were really bad. I mean, I never in my life thought I would see a American politician advocate for a revival of the idea of price controls, much less price controls over groceries, which is where she went. That is a surefire way to end up with shortages in grocery stores. We've seen it happen time and time again. Price controls lead to shortages. Economists left, right, and center will tell you that price controls are a bad idea. But Kamala has decided that that's going to be her answer to inflation. No wonder why they, tried to keep that under wraps for as long as possible.
Yeah, I guess Kamala's calculus, the way I see it, is either it's due to us. There's two reasons for inflation: either due to the reckless spending and anti-energy policies that we undertook, or it's due to corporate greed. And they're just going lock, stock, and barrel for the second option. But what would you tell the average blue-pilled leftist that believes that corporate greed is the reason for the inflation we've had?
You'd really wonder, why did inflation go up by so much if it's rooted in greed when Biden took office? Did Biden inspire an outbreak of greed? The last time we had inflation rise by this much, it was under Jimmy Carter. Was Jimmy Carter the age of greed? If greed is driving inflation, it tells you that greed isn't, just a constant thing in the world, but that is a thing that fluctuates somehow and got really high under Biden. First of all, if that is what happened, then we should definitely vote Biden-Harris out of office because they're driving people nuts with greed. But I think what's really happening is this is a denial of fundamental economic forces. It says, no, I'm going to try to blame something, that you cannot ever put your finger on it, rather than the policies that actually lead to inflation. She's trying to escape responsibility for that and blame basically, fundamental human sin for the rise in prices.
I've been watching reports that she's referring to herself as an underdog. And I find that kind of, ironic, eye-popping even. How can you call yourself an underdog when you are the incumbent basically running? She's got, the minute she went to the top of the ticket, she had access to a much larger war chest. The donations started coming in. She's got more, she's better funded. She's got the media machine behind her. The Media Research Center just did a report examining the positive coverage for Kamala was at about 89%, and the negative coverage for Trump was at 90%. And I just think, how can you call yourself an incumbent when a lot of the mainstream stations don't even cover him? They don't cover any of his rallies or anything that he says on issues. They simply cover, some of his obviously remarks that probably most of us wish he wouldn't say, but the issues are very important, and he's got good positions.
Well, look, one of the things, first of all, the idea that she's an underdog is ridiculous. She had the president of the United States pushing for her on the debate stage at the Democratic National Convention. The media is running stories like, what wonderful clothes she's wearing at the Democratic Convention. These are like absurd stories that you would never read about a Republican candidate, no matter who it was. It's not about whether it's Donald Trump or J.D. Vance. They just run these sort of glowing profiles of her because that's what they like to do. They want people to cheer on their candidate. And so the notion that she's an underdog is ridiculous. She comes in here as an incumbent, burdened by the Biden record. And I don't think she'll be able to escape that, not just because she was Biden's vice president, but because she, on her own, using her constitutional authority, made a lot of the key Biden pieces of legislation that helped drive inflation really high possible because she cast a record number of tie-breaking votes in the U.S. Senate. That's not something she was ever obligated to do. As vice president, that is one of the few authorities she has to herself. Joe Biden can't tell her, you must go into the Senate and vote this way. This is a choice that the vice president makes. So each of these pieces of legislation, in particular, the massive inflationary American Rescue Plan, $2 trillion at the beginning of the administration that set off the entire inflation inferno, She voted for it. Wouldn't have passed without her vote. That's on her. And so and I think the American people won't let her get away with trying to escape the record of the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration.
To ask you about a little twist I heard about today, which could really throw a wrench in things, is that Nicole Shanahan, RFK Jr.'s running mate, was on a podcast and said that they are trying to decide between sticking it out and trying to hit that 5% so they can access the public funds and truly create a third party, a strong third party, or pack it in and endorse Trump.
So I think that I actually tend to think that the third party candidacy doesn't matter as much as people tend to think it does. In this case, it seems the Kennedy-Shanahan ticket seems to be drawing a little bit from both Republicans and Democrats, a little bit from independents who might go either way. So I think it's really hard to tell whether or not they would swing the election. Plus, a lot of people, we've seen this before, a lot of people, when a pollster calls them up and say, who do you support, will name a third party candidate. But when they get into the voting booth, people don't even go into the voting booth anymore. When they're filling out their little piece of paper at home that says how they're going to vote, they actually decide, you know what, I'm going to vote for one of the two major candidates. So a lot of times the third party candidate overpolls and then underperforms. I wouldn't be surprised if we see that when the rubber meets the road, people decide they're going to vote for somebody who might win rather than just a statement vote on somebody who's definitely going to lose.
I just hate to be at his Thanksgiving table in November. If he ends up endorsing Trump, I'd hate to be at his family table for Thanksgiving. The Kennedy family will go wild. He should bring a bear with him and just lay it on the table and say, this is what we're having for Thanksgiving. Exactly.
John, the economy seems to be softening, going from bad to worse in many different aspects. I just read that Subway restaurants had to have like an emergency franchise meeting because basically, from what I read, their business model doesn't work under this inflationary environment. How do you see the economy playing out between, say, now and election day in 10 weeks?
So I think that we are starting to see signs of consumers being squeezed by inflation, and that hurts things like Subway, obviously, where they don't feel like they can push up the price of a Subway sandwich anymore. But when they keep offering all these discounts, it's very hard for them to stay profitable after their, inflation has raised their labor costs and raised the cost of materials, raised the cost of just renting the space that they're operating out of. So they get squeezed by inflation. I don't think the economy is about to fall off a cliff, though. And I know that's a little controversial. A lot of people will say, no, it's actually weaker. The labor force isn't as strong as it is. But if you look at things like consumer spending, retail sales, they're actually still very strong. So I think the economy is doing pretty well. And in fact, I think the Fed is probably going to cut interest rates when they probably shouldn't. The economy is not at a state where it needs an interest rate cut. They should hold off on that until after the election. There's no economic emergency happening. We have had so far one relatively weak jobs report, but just one. If we get a bunch more, sure, then I'll start to worry. Right now, I don't think we're on the verge of a recession.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you may have seen that, I believe tomorrow the Labor Department is supposed to come out with a document with another huge downward revision. I know you've covered these in the past. It just seems like every jobs report has these big downward revisions. Is there more to the labor market than what we're seeing in these monthly jobs report? What is the situation? In your reporting, what is the labor market, small business, Main Street situation on the ground right now?
So it's very interesting. We have had a very tight labor market that has been very hard for small businesses to find adequate workforces. And that has been a complaint for a number of years. It was a complaint immediately after the pandemic when there were a lot of people out of work, but they were still having trouble hiring people. It's still a complaint. Even with the downward revision, I think the labor market is still relatively tight. Any small business person I talk to says they're having trouble finding workers, not, oh, there's, unemployed people lining the streets. So I think that the labor market remains tight. The thing about these revisions that fascinates me is that the range of estimates of how big the revisions might be is enormously wide. Professional economists, the guys at JP Morgan Chase are saying that we're going to have 360,000 jobs erased. Goldman Sachs says we're going to have 1 million. That's a huge range. And what it shows is that it's really hard to understand right now what's going on in the economy. The highest paid people in the private sector are, have a huge range of where they think this is going to come out. And I think a huge part of that actually has to do with how many people have crossed the border and what that has done to the labor force. We're just not sure. We've never had this kind of open border crisis in America where we have, millions and millions of people pouring across all at once. We're not sure what that does to the labor force.
You mentioned the consumer spending is really strong. And obviously that's a big part of our economy. And I've read that too, but I've also read sort of the flip side of it about the credit card debt, and that we're at new highs that we've not seen, obviously new lows on savings, but we're at 1.13 or 4 trillion in credit card debt. And I mean, the argument on the other side you could make is that people are spending on their credit cards money that they don't have, and they're paying more because of the inflation, but getting less.
I think that's right. I think that we are seeing people sort of at the risk of overextending themselves. I mean, one thing to remember about a lot of these credit card numbers is one of the reasons they're so high is because prices are so high. So it's not necessarily that people are buying a lot more stuff. It's just the stuff they buy got so much more expensive. But yes, there is a risk that people are overextending themselves on their credit cards. We're starting to see delinquency rates go back up as well. That is troubling. But when people are willing, and they are willing, when you see things like airfares, people are still getting on board planes, which is and still eating out at restaurants, which is a very discretionary form of spending. That's spending that I think would drop if people were going to pull back on spending. So even though we may be extending the economic expansion on credit, that still means we're going to keep extending the economic expansion. It could make the reckoning worse one day, but it means that the expansion will keep happening as long as people are willing to keep spending.
And if the Fed cuts rates, is that a sign? Well, first, I've read some folks think that it's going to be only a 1/4 point, because if it was as high as a 1/2 point, that would really spook the markets into that they're nervous about a recession. I mean, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that the Fed probably shouldn't cut at all. They are going to cut. They've made that very clear. I think they'll just do 1/4 point and not a 1/2 point. They could do a 1/2 point, and I don't think that will spook the markets because the market has already priced it in. If they did more than that, then people would worry. But right now, the market says, yeah, I think they're going to do 1/2 point. I don't see why they would need to do that. I don't think that there's any reason to do that. I think actually we'll learn from the Federal Reserve this week when Jerome Powell speaks from Jackson Hole, where they have this big conference every year. I think he's going to try to talk the market out of the idea of a 50 basis point cut just to a 25 basis point cut. I do think there's a big risk that if the Fed cuts, whether it's 25 or 50, but then sends the market an indication like, slow down, we're going to cut now, and then wait to see what happens. It could be one of these sort of buy the rumor, sell the news events in the stock market where people, the stock market goes up in anticipation of the cut. And then when you actually get it, it may come down as people worry, well, maybe they're done for a little while. What if they don't cut again? And it's sort of priced in that they just keep cutting from now on. So the Fed could upend those expectations and then hurt the market.
The Democrats' platform released recently just seems like more and more of this kind of Santa Claus economic policy where the government just gives money, whether it's $25,000 now for houses. We've seen them try to eliminate student loan debt. They've talked about now eliminating medical debt, which again will just push up medical bills even more. I could go on and on to expanding the child tax credit, expanding the earned income tax credit. It just never ends. The solution is always the same: more government spending. how do we as conservatives make the case that our free market policies are better to the average person on the street that just says, oh, great, more money?
Right. Well, I think that it's important to differentiate between certain things. First of all, there's no real such thing as debt forgiveness, because all you're really doing is passing the burden of that spending onto somebody else. So if they do medical debt forgiveness, for instance, you can't really forgive the medical debt. The doctors have been paid, the surgeons have been paid, the drugs have to be paid for. So what are you doing? You're really saying, okay, the people who didn't incur the medical debt should actually have to be responsible for it. So, one is to just drive home. There's no magic wand. We don't make debt disappear. We can just move who pays for it around. I would say also, look, conservatives should say we're for tax cuts. Families are overburdened. Family formation in America is overburdened. We do want tax cuts. So, differentiate between the really dangerous things they propose, like debt forgiveness, like subsidies for home buyers and price controls. Say those are the bad things that will actually really hurt the economy. Cutting taxes is a good idea. That could help the economy. It can make things actually work well, as long as you're not doing it in such a way where the government's trying to force people into narrowly, if the government says, oh, by the way, we'll give you a tax break as long as you don't drive an internal combustion engine, that'll be a problem economically. But if they do a broad tax cut, such as, if you have children, we're going to relieve your tax burden, that's probably a good idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I should clarify a refundable UBI tax credit.
The problem with the UBI stuff, and I think this is a really important thing, is when you pay people who aren't working, that might be fine. But when you have entire geographic areas, what ended up happening the last time we had welfare that basically gave people a lot of money when they had more children, is that you ended up with neighborhoods, entire social groups where there was nobody working at all. That's really detrimental, not just to the people who are paying the bills for that sort of thing, but to the people receiving the benefit. It actually discourages work, and it's really even more detrimental to the children who grow up in a work-free atmosphere. We want to make sure that whatever we do, we avoid repeating those mistakes of the last welfare state, the ones that we got rid of, frankly. 30 years ago, we reformed welfare so that wouldn't happen. We don't want to revive that this time around.
Right. My last question is just about the national debt. I think we were at $1.2 trillion this year. It's going to be the third largest part of the budget, even outstripping defense spending. Do you think that the next administration, whoever it is going to face a bit of a reckoning on the national debt?
I used to be a pessimist on this and just say we're just going to rack up debt forever. Mm-hmm. I think that the people were so upset by inflation and are able to make the connection between very high levels of deficit spending and this inflation that we actually may have a chance to rein in the debt. And I think that we will see that. So I'm become newly hopeful that there may actually be a political constituency in America for having some financial responsibility, something that frankly really hasn't been in my lifetime. So this would be a new thing, but a welcome change.
The debates are coming up. And actually, we've obviously already seen Trump in one debate with Biden, which obviously changed the entire direction of this, of history, the campaign. Yeah, I mean, history for sure. As we go into this next debate, he agreed to some pretty stringent rules to debate Biden. I mean, it was mic cut. There was, no audience, no live audience. It was all their rules. Are you aware of whether or not the same rules are going to apply with Kamala? And lastly, what would be your advice to Donald Trump going into this debate with Kamala Harris?
So first of all, I mean, it is funny that Donald Trump may have been aided in the debate by the very rules that Kamala put on. Forcing Donald Trump not to interrupt Joe Biden made it so that Joe Biden was able to display his, feebleness for all of us. If Donald Trump had been interrupting him, we might not have really seen the uninterrupted Joe Biden. And I think actually a similar thing could happen with Kamala Harris. The uninterrupted Kamala Harris is probably worse than the interrupted Kamala Harris. So if I were Donald Trump, I'd say, that worked last time. Answer the questions when asked. Don't interrupt. Maybe tone down some of the Trumpiness that can be displayed during. There's one, I love his rallies. They're amazing. The debate shouldn't be a rally. It should be a chance for America to see these two people in action. And then I would say, look, you're winning on the economy. Make sure you bring home every answer to economics. When Americans are asked, the economy is their top issue. Donald Trump is always ahead on the economy. The American people see what Biden and Harris did to the economy. They can tell and if you push her on the economy, I think that's the path to victory for Donald Trump.
I think that's good advice. Well, John, where can our listeners find your stories and your newsletter?
Sure. Well, Breitbart Business Digest comes out every day. It's a free newsletter. You can sign up for it under newsletters at Breitbart. It's up on the upper right-hand corner of the screen. Again, free, comes out every day. It explains not just what's happened in the economy, but why that happened and what's going to happen next. And of course, every day on Breitbart.com, you can find us. You can go to Breitbart.com/economics. You'll find all the economic stories. But everything my coworkers read is worth reading too. So go to the front page. Again, the Breitbart Business Digest, I have to say, is really we have gotten so many things right throughout this economic cycle that people, if you're reading it, you really will be able to know what's going to happen before everybody else.
I agree. I encourage everybody to go there. It's good stuff. Well, John, thanks so much for joining us again today and letting us pick your brain. I appreciate the time, love the input as well. And thank you everyone for joining us on Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. You can subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts from, and we'll be back soon with another episode.